So thank you. I'm delighted to be here and with my former census colleagues, all of whom are some of the best people I've ever had the opportunity to work with. So before I get into evaluation, let me just say one more thing about the redistricting data and differential privacy that might be of interest to you. So a feature of differential privacy is that it's going to actually make available measures of uncertainty for the block level data in the redistricting file. So this will be the first time those data have been given to the community with associated measures of uncertainty. So that might actually generate some stories. Okay, so I'm going to do a little background. I'm going to talk about two kinds of evaluations, operational measures, and the primary focus here is going to be on self-response rates because that's going to be of most importance or most interest to members of the media. And then evaluation of census coverage. I'll talk about that, some methods, results, some litigation that's happened over census coverage, maybe the potential for some future litigation over census coverage. And I'm also going to talk about why, again, emphasize why the census is so important and why there's such a concern over the accuracy of the census. So let's just talk about a little background. The Census Bureau is one of the 13 principal statistical agencies. They are all, including the Census Bureaus, committed to being open and objective in the work they do, including the evaluation of their programs. So the Census Bureau has always evaluated their programs and made those publicly available, and sometimes they've gotten beaten up because of that, but that doesn't matter. They still view it as their responsibility, correctly so, to put this out. So every census going back to at least 1950, and probably before that, but that's as far back as I was able to research, has had a really robust evaluation program and an experimental program. And some of the results of that have been the mail-out, mail-back census that debuted in 1970. That was based on research conducted after the 1950 and the 1960 census. The paid advertising and partnership program that Steve talked about, that was also based on some evaluation programs. I'll talk about that a little bit too. In all of this, measurement of coverage and something called the differential undercount has been of paramount interest. There was significant litigation regarding coverage measurement or the use of sampling and statistical adjustment to correct for coverage errors in the 1980, the 1990, and the 2000 censuses. And as I said, the discussion today will be mostly on self-response and coverage measurement. So let's dive into self-response. So as I said today, the current Census Bureau projection for 2020 self-response is 60.5%. And as they've said, that's very, very important. One, they have based their anticipated non-response follow-up workload along with contingencies on that response rate. If there is a significant shortfall, then don't ask me what significant is, but say 5%, 10% shorter of what they're looking at, that would have serious implications. It would generate lots of news stories, and the Bureau would have to they probably would not have recruited a sufficient enough enumerator workforce to complete non-response follow-up on schedule. Believe me, the Bureau would do all they could to eventually complete non-response follow-up, and they've never missed the legally mandated deadline of providing the accounts to the President by December 31st. So another thing, low self-response is also a predictor of hard to enumerate areas. And I just think, as Burton said today, self-response data is generally viewed as more accurate than the data collected by enumerators for a number of reasons. So the good news is the Census Bureau is going to monitor the self-response on at least a daily basis, if not maybe hourly basis, for a variety of geographic areas. They're going to make those data available, as they said today, so that stakeholders, including local governments and advocacy groups and other leaders, can look at their areas and understand where the response is low and take actions to increase the response, because that's in everybody's interest. And then I'm going to talk about the 1990 census, because this was an instance where the self-response was seriously off and had some pretty significant implications, but also resulted in some evaluations that were important. So let's look at that. In 1990, the anticipated, so I didn't put a reference on this, and I should have, but if you Google the 1991 Census Bureau Annual Research Conference, most of the conference was, or a big part of the conference was devoted to this, and there's some papers written in there that go into this in great detail about what happened with the self-response. So just Google Census Bureau 1991 Annual Research Conference, and you'll find it. So in 1990, they expected the self-response, in this case, male self-response, to be 70%. And I was working at the Bureau at the time. The Census Bureau actually believed that was a very conservative number, that they reduced it about 5% from the previous census, you know, everybody, so it'll never get below that. Well, it came in at 65%, which caused a lot of problems. One problem was the Bureau had to go back. They ran out of money because they had to put more effort into the non-response follow-up. They had to go back to the Congress, actually OMB, the Administration of Congress, and they asked for over $100 million more to finish the census. I was fortunately working on the undercount problem in 1990 and didn't have to do that. But my former boss was of the opinion he was going to get fired when he went back and asked for that money, but he didn't. So the Census Bureau also, though, realized that they had to do some evaluations of what happened to cause this. And they did several evaluations, and they found a couple important things. One, that actually the awareness of the census in 1990 was higher than it had been in the previous census, 1980. And that shows what I think people have now learned, is that just awareness of something is not enough to motivate behavior. So that was something that jumped out at the Census Bureau. The one finding that they didn't probe too much, but what they found was significantly was that the biggest factor among those respondents that did not self-respond was that they said they did not receive a form. That was one of the big findings. They found other things that we know today. There were age differences in self-response. Older people responded with a higher degree than younger people, and that distrust, alienation of government, even in 1990, was a factor in the self-response. So if you remember, at the time, we were going to an area where the mail marketing industry was going really crazy, and there was, you know, just your mailbox was being flooded by different ads and all that. There was a feeling that maybe people just couldn't separate the census form from other commercial mailings, but that was never proved. But anyway, the important thing was, based on that research, the Bureau knew that they had to do more to motivate both how people would receive the mail. So they did an extensive research program with a man named Don Dillman on how to do mail census methodology, different ways to do mail treatments, and some of that is still used today. And it was really quite an extensive study of different ways to do mail treatments. The other thing they also did was they said, you know, as I think Steve mentioned, we cannot depend on pro bono advertising anymore. We have to come up with a program that will actually motivate behavior instead of awareness. And therefore, that was the groundwork of going into the paid advertising and partnership program. So it shows you how important evaluations are of one census in planning the next. And that was one of, I think, the major innovations. I'll talk about this later, the paid advertising and partnership program. So let's talk about coverage evaluation. So go back to, why is the census so important? So the census is used, we've heard this, Burton talked about it yesterday. It's used for apportionment, it's used for redistricting, local planners use it, businesses use it. Another use, which doesn't get quite as much, but is just as important, is that the census and the census carried forward in the form of post-census estimates is used to control virtually every public and private demographic survey. And many of these surveys are used for purposes other than the census to allocate funding or resources. So, for example, at my old company I was at, we did a program that we used to help the CDC distribute or allocate their Vaccines for Children program. And what made our survey accurate was we used census data as controls for our survey to make sure the survey was representative. And so if there's an undercount in the decennial census for a particular group, that undercount will show up in the American Community Survey, it will show up in the Current Population Survey, it will show up in every demographic survey that depends on the Census Bureau for 10 years. And that's why there's so much concern. That's just one of the many reasons. There's so much concern about the accuracy of the census and why it has been the subject. So now getting into it a little bit, there's two ways that have been used to measure overcounts and undercounts, undercounts and overcounts. It's called a post-enumeration survey and dual system estimation and demographic analysis. And you'll, as the 2020 census rolls up, towards the end of it, you'll hear about both of these. But for just to shorten these things, for the remainder of the discussion, I'm going to call the first one DSE and the second one DA for dual system estimation demographic analysis. And I'm not going to actually put up a formula for dual system estimation. If you want to see a formula, you see me afterwards, and I can give you some references for that. But I don't think you need to learn how to do dual system estimation to rate your stories. But essentially, the methodology is you conduct a post-enumeration survey that's independent of the decennial census. You match the post-enumeration survey to the decennial census, and this lets you calculate a dual system estimate of the true population. And I put true in quotes because you never estimate the true population, but it's an estimate for various population groups and areas. And you estimate coverage error by taking the dual system estimate, subtracting the census from it, and dividing by the dual system estimate for any group of interest. And that'll give you an undercount or an overcount. The DA methodology, demographic analysis, uses administrative records and estimates and assumptions to estimate, again, the true population of the United States by age, sex, and black, non-black categories. They actually, for 2010, I think, did a few age categories for the Hispanic population, I think up to age 19. I could be a little off on that. But so the records they use includes births, deaths, Medicare records, and legal immigration. Some of the estimates include estimates of illegal immigration and emigration. You know, the United States is a free country. You don't have to ask anybody to leave. You can just leave. The coverage error, again, is estimated as DA minus census divided by DA. You just subtract and divide, and that gives you undercounts or overcounts. So let me just do a comparison of these two methods. They sort of differ in two fundamental ways. Granularity, and that is the DA provides national estimates by age, sex, black and non-black at the national level. The dual system provides national, state, local, down to the county, and even maybe lower, estimates by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin categories. So the dual system is much more of a tool used to evaluate the accuracy of the census for various population groups, such as American Indians on reservations, off reservations, Asian population, et cetera. The other big thing is the timing. So demographic analysis is available before any decennial census counts, including the apportionment numbers, at least in the last census. In the last census, it was, thanks to a decision by Bob Groves that all of us on the outside thought was crazy, but it worked out beautifully, was to make the DA available before the actual census counts were released, everybody thought, oh, no, this is going to be a disaster. But Bob said, no, this is a teaching moment. And he was right. And we were all the rest of us were wrong. And they put out demographic analysis and ranges to show the uncertainty. And I hope that the next director would also follow Bob's lead and do the same thing, because it is very informative in terms of what to expect and look forward to. So in 2010, the DA came out December 6th. The dual system estimation, it's more comprehensive, but it takes longer to produce. And so in the last census, it came out on May 22nd, 2012. So that is significantly after the census results have been out. As you saw from James' slides, the redistricting data will have been out, so a lot of the census other data. So let's talk a little bit about some of the results. And this is, I think you all have copies of this in your package. But this shows the 2010, 2000, and 1990 census dual system estimation results by some racial and ethnic categories. And I think one of the important things is you see on 1990, there's an asterisk by every number. The asterisk means it's statistically significant from 0, which means that you could conclude in any kind of statistical model testing or anything that that estimate is real, it's different from 0, there is an undercount. They were all undercounts in 1990. I think the other thing to take away from 2000 and 2010, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this, is that they're not all significantly different from 0. So the undercounts have definitely been reduced in terms of their scope, the net undercounts for these groups. Some of them are still significantly different from 0. For the most part, they're different from they're lower statistically than the 1990 estimates. I did the statistical tests on that. Let me pop up with a couple graphics. This one just shows, it's more of a visual. It shows the DSA coverage estimates from 2010, 2000, and 1990 in a graphical form. And it goes from the 1990 census to the 2000 census to the 2010 census. This gets you an idea of just what it would look like graphically. I should say that the largest one there is the American Indians on reservations in 1990. And in 2000, the measurement from the dual system estimation did not show a large undercount for American Indians on reservations. That estimate, though, had a very large level of sampling error. So I wouldn't just say that the Census Bureau did a perfect job on American Indians on reservations in 2000. So we talked a little bit about the differential undercount. So what this is the differential undercount is the measure of a particular race group relative to white non-Hispanic. And this shows the differential undercounts for the non-black Hispanic population and the Hispanic population. The rest of the differential undercounts have quite a bit of uncertainty in them, and I didn't feel comfortable putting them up. But what you can see is that while the overall undercounts have come down, the differential undercounts have not been reduced as much. And if we went back to the chart that showed the coverage errors, that's because the white population has been overcounted more. So there's still a differential between the white population and the non-white populations. And in fact, one of those differences, I believe it's the non-Hispanic black difference is really not statistically different from 1990 in terms of the variance. I think the Hispanic is. But it still shows you, that there is a differential undercount today, and there's lots of room for improvement. So let's talk about one other thing. I've used this, and I'll talk a little bit about the citizenship question too here. This is an illustration of the importance of the Integrated Communications and Partnership Program. So the 1990 census, as Stephen mentioned, did not have an Integrated Communications and Partnership Program, and the 2000 census and 2010 censuses did. Now, the graph here shows you the 2010 census versus 1990. If you plopped up the 2000 census, it would be exactly the same as the 2010. They're not very different. And I can affirm, I was actually doing Al Fontenot's job in 2000. I was the person in charge of the 2000 census. I was the associate director. And I can tell you that the only difference between the 2000 census and the 1990 census was the Integrated Communications and Partnership Program. And I say that because we were going to do a different census methodology for 2000. We were going to be using sampling, and we were going to be using statistical adjustment to correct the census for undercounts. And there was a lawsuit. The lawsuit came through. It said you can't do that for apportionment. So this came through in January of 1999, and we had to default back to the 1990 census process because that's all we had time to do at that point. And so the procedures we used were just lifted from what we did in 1990. And what this shows you, though, in these two maps, red is not a good thing. They're on the same scale, and it shows you the difference in coverage. And I firmly believe that a big component driving that difference was the fact that in 2000, the Census Bureau was able to get out a message, both at the national and local levels, that the census was, one, important, why it was important, and two, the census was confidential. And we got that message out, and we got people to be counted. So the issue in the Census Bureau, believe me, is going to do everything they can, do partnership, and make sure everybody gets counted. I know that they're just going to do their best. But if for some reason the citizenship question stays on and prevents them from getting out the message that the census will be confidential, and they're going to try their best, you could be looking at a situation like this, because one of the big motivators of being counted is the message that that your data is confidential. It's not going to be given to ICE, DHS, the CIA, anyone else, and that's the message that census has to get out. So let me wrap up with a little history of some census litigations. So the 1980 census, there was litigation after the census to use statistical adjustment to correct the 1980 census for undercounts. And this was brought by a number of cities, and it was centered in New York. At the time, well, after a long, lengthy court period, the plaintiffs did not prevail, and the 1980 census was not adjusted. As a footnote, the coverage measurement didn't really work that well in 1980. There were 12 different estimates of the coverage error. A couple of them were national overcounts, and some were undercounts. So it just didn't work quite right, and we don't have time to go into why. In 1990, there was litigation that was brought before the census to use statistical methods to adjust the 1990 census to correct for undercounts. It was brought by a number of cities. This was also consolidated in New York. There was just a lot of concern about that. In the end, again, even though the Census Bureau recommended that statistical methods be used to adjust the Census Bureau director endorsed that recommendation. The Secretary of Commerce decided not to adjust the census, and was found, because he did everything right, his decision was upheld in subsequent court litigation. And I could talk a lot more about this, but I think that's it. So 2000 was really interesting. After the 1990 census, because they ran out of money, the coverage wasn't that good, the Census Bureau and the Congress both commissioned two panels of the National Academy of Science to give them recommendations for how to take the 2000 census. And those recommendations both came back exactly the same, and that is use sampling to save money, use statistical adjustment to make it accurate, and if you can, try to use administrative records. Well, at the time, the state of the art for administrative records wasn't what it is today at the Bureau, so that was sort of off the table. But the Bureau didn't know how to do statistical sampling, statistical adjustment. They went through the whole decade planning that, and you know, as you remember, Bill Clinton was the president, and then the Congress turned to be Republican, and the Republicans didn't like the idea of statistical adjustment. Of course, that meant that the Democrats did like the idea of statistical adjustment. There wasn't a whole lot of science in this. It was just, you know, it's going to help us and hurt them. And the Bureau was in the process of saying, we're following good science. And the Bureau did follow good science. It got to the point where the House of Representatives actually sued the Department of Commerce to not use statistical sampling. That ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court determined that statistical sampling could not be used for the purposes of apportionment. The Supreme Court was silent on all other aspects, and in fact, the Census Bureau actually produced statistically adjusted redistricting data, but determined that the data, the statistical methods were not accurate enough to support a statistical adjustment, that they didn't work in the 2000 time frame, and I could talk a lot more about that. But in any event, the Census Bureau ultimately recommended not to use it for redistricting. But they did go to that. Now, had they recommended that, I'm sure there would have been another court case, and we would have had some idea of whether of what it was. But that didn't happen. So that's a history of the litigation. Let me just conclude that there are a lot of entities that I've talked to that are looking for a remedy if the 2020 census does have large undercounts. And the remedy most of them are talking about is doing some kind of adjustment of the data for as many purposes as they can. There might undoubtedly be litigation, as there was in 1980, to statistically adjust the 2020 census to correct for coverage errors. Who knows? I mean, you know, but and this is the United States. You're allowed to sue for anything in the United States, and so the census certainly has been the subject of a whole lot of litigation, much more than is on this slide. So that's it.
So how you mentioned the undercount, but how hard of a sell would it be to get people to participate if the citizenship question is on there? And can you also talk about the undercount and the impact of displaced people from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria?
So, I have gone so far as to say that, and I had 5 other former directors that joined me in this, that the citizenship question has not been adequately tested in the context of a contemporary census environment. It hasn't been administered, as Margot showed, without being preceded by a question on place of birth. So there's really no information regarding what will happen. Now, there is a significant risk that you could have a large undercount, but it's a risk. Other people that I don't want to speak for, because I don't represent the communities they represent, have said that it will cause an undercount, but I don't represent those communities. And in terms of Puerto Rico, I mean, the Bureau is going to do the best they can to count Puerto Rico. I mean, they talked about that, but I...
Hi, I'm Katie Leslie with WRC News 4 in D.C. Also about the citizenship question, I'm hoping you are free to give us your real opinion. I know there's a lot of trepidation around that question. Even if the Supreme Court shoots it down, do you think the damage is already done from a PR perspective, and regardless of what is on the ballot, pardon me, I covered politics too long, on the survey, that people will just not believe, you know, or not trust the enumerators?
You know, there are concerns that a lot of the trust has been done. On the other hand, it would certainly help the Census Bureau's outreach effort if the question wasn't there. It would be, I think, an easier lift for them to convince people that their data would not be given to ICE because there wouldn't be any citizenship data on it, for example.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, regarding, like, as somebody who does a lot of, like, demographic change kind of analysis, I was wondering, since there has been so much change in terms of methodology as well as undercount, differential undercount in the different decennial censuses, do you have any advice for someone like me who's trying to, like, estimate whether or not certain populations have increased or decreased over time? How much can I attribute to real change, and how much can I attribute to, like, changes in the way that the census was carried out? And then also, could you elaborate a little bit on the block group uncertainty thing that you mentioned briefly in the beginning?
So I think that when you look at population growth, I think a lot of the growth has been much larger than an undercount. And you could adjust it for an undercount and carry it forward and do analysis that way. There's lots of demographers that actually take that into account and study it. So what I was saying was as James was saying, previously the Census Bureau used disclosure avoidance techniques, but because of confidentiality concerns would not describe, they would describe in very general terms the kind of disclosure they use, like data swapping, but they wouldn't describe the rate of swapping or things like that, because that would actually have reduced the safeguards in the data. So they kept that confidential. An aspect of differential privacy is that you actually are explicit about the methods you use and about the kinds of uncertainty that is in the data. And so this will provide measures of uncertainty that will come out and accompany the redistricting. They might not accompany it, but they'll be available so that users of the redistricting data will understand there's uncertainty in them. And so for the first time, they're going to actually have some concrete measures that there is uncertainty in the data. So, for example, the file that is produced by the American Community Survey that's used for the census voting age population tabulations is produced at the block group level, which is bigger than a block. That's like 300. It's like an average of 300 housing units a block group. 500, okay, something like that. And the American Community Survey is based on the sample, so those data have an associated measure of sampling error with them. Well, this will be the first time the redistricting community is going to get data with a measure of uncertainty. It'll be something like a margin of error. I don't know exactly how the Census Bureau is going to describe it, but it'll be something like that, which will undoubtedly cause some stories, I'm sure, about from various members in the redistricting community.
We'll have one last question here.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there any data or information or studies that you know of, or maybe you know on top of your head, that looks at how much money from federal grant money and other ways that counties can lose if they are undercounted, or is there any information on, especially in concerns of...
There is. So if you go to the GW website and you look for Andrew Reamer, Professor Andrew Reamer, R-E-A-M-E-R, you'll find some analyses of federal grant programs based on census data, and he also does some analyses of the effect of undercounts on the allocation of the data.
Yeah, I would add that the other thing he does that's very interesting is he's looking now at other types of funding distribution at the state and local level by state and local governments that's based on population data as well. We, the Census Bureau, have not done that. But that even makes the distinctions more profound. I think it's kind of very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question and we'll break.
Sure. In regards to the litigation you mentioned before, I'm just wondering if you know of any other instance in the past where there's been, I mean, we have the citizenship question now, and where there's been something that's had a kind of comparable chilling effect before the census, or where there was thoughts amongst the Bureau that, wow, whatever's happening right now could really make people afraid to answer. And the litigation you showed didn't seem like the sort of thing that the average person would be thinking about. And I'm wondering if there were other examples like that.
I'd turn to Margot to see. Margot would be a better.
The comparable, sort of fuss and bother was when a question on income was put on the 1940 census, but the environment, the enumeration environment was different, so that it was an enumerator-based census, and the Bureau worked out, it turned out it was high-income people who objected to answering the income question. So what they did was said, okay, if the they told the enumerators, if you run into problems with this question, they don't want to answer it, hand them a postcard, and they can send in the answer on a postcard. And that was what was used, and there was no problem. So in fact, it only asked, did you make, I think the highest category was $5,000 at that point for annual income. But there's nothing like the citizenship question, which is, as I said, going to people raw with no intervention between, to explain it. And that's part of the issue.